Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, but let's go to Montreal today, shall we? I want to meet Eddy Perez. We're just beginning to get acquainted. Eddy Perez is a Francophone Canadian in Montreal, although his office is in Ottawa. I bet you're not in your office because of COVID, right? Have everything shut down there?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And we're going to talk about climate diplomacy, which is a term that I never heard before until a few minutes ago, but I just think it is a cool term. I think I would love to be a climate diplomat, and that's what this guy is. Eddy Perez has worked at the IPCC headquarters, I guess, in Geneva, and he's going to explain to us a little bit about what IPCC is, Intergovernmental Program on Climate Change. Am I close? Close or not? Panel. Good. All right. Thank you. Okay. Hi, Eddy. How are you?
Hi, Metta. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
You teach at the University of Montreal, and you are the international climate diplomat for the Climate Action Network in Ottawa, right? Which is an umbrella organization of climate change NGOs in Canada. And it's connected to an international outfit, also Climate Action Network. Have I got it right?
You've got it right.
All right. So now we're all briefed, except about the IPCC. Tell our viewers where you worked and what kind of outfit it was and how it functions.
Yes, I was at the IPCC working within the Secretariat. It was a bit of a mixed bag between my master's and a professional experience in my university, where I finished my master's. You're required to go work. You have to go to the field for an important number of months, and you have to put to test the things that you've learned through your program. And
fabulous. So what was your university and what program were you in?
I was in a program. The name of the university is a Francophone one, is the National Research Institute of Quebec. And the program was public policy and public action. And my study was on the work of the IPCC in the inclusion of non-traditional actors. So those actors that are not necessarily the main target of the IPCC when they release these very important reports. And so while I did my academic studies on the IPCC, I then had to move. I moved to Geneva and went to work and had my badge, my IPCC badge, and worked within the Secretariat, worked in the organization of the 48th session of the IPCC in Montreal, developed products for them, and really helped me understand the importance of the work behind the scenes. There's a lot of unknown about the critical work that the IPCC does before the release of those big reports. Is not just a one-off. It takes years of organization, and to say the least, I learned a lot about the human side of climate science, and the importance of representation within climate science. So
what do you mean? The importance of representation?
Yeah. So the IPCC, when we speak about climate science, we always have the impression that is the study of emissions, the physical understanding of the oceans. It's actually a lot more than that. The climate crisis has particular and different impacts, and it a different understanding from one country to the other, from one region to the other. The way we perceive climate action in Canada is way different than in the United States, even if the physical science is facts, right? But the way in which the science gets translated into action really is context specific. When we talk about adaptation it's really local. It is definitely related to the policies and the policies and the infrastructures of specific communities that are either able to understand the impact of the climate crisis or need to further increase their adaptive capacity. And so when it comes to these very specific issues on how you get science translated into the day-to-day issues, then you understand that the IPCC as a body has two challenges. The first one is to get the best assessment possible about understanding the problem, which I think they do really well. And they have developed for the past 3 decades institutions to really get us the most comprehensive, updated reports on the climate science and its impacts and the possibility for response. But the other one is then bringing ownership to this information globally, making sure that, sorry about that, from Canada to Australia to New Zealand to Togo to Colombia to China to Russia to South Africa, Saudi Arabia, all these countries everywhere around the world then get to understand the science and then take action on it. The IPCC is an intergovernmental institution, but that doesn't mean that you speak to all the groups of society. It doesn't mean that because governments are represented there, that this information is being translated and being brought to the people who are really feeling the impacts of the climate crisis. And that was part of my job. That was really
I immediately have two different questions.
Of course.
And the first one has to do with your first statement, which is that it takes years to prepare, that there's a lot of background work before you get one of those reports, such as the one we got a few days ago.
Yeah.
And that is, in fact, what worries me a little bit. Maybe it takes too long, because I've heard people say that by the time a report comes out, it's actually 2 years obsolete. And that there are things that the report, any IPCC report, will not contain that it should contain, partly because of this lag, and maybe also because of some conservatism in the orientation of I don't know, the people deciding what needs to be covered or not. I'm thinking, for example, of some, let me say, just off the top of my head, which could be wrong, very wrong, which is that my impression is that there's maybe not as much focus on negative emissions in the IPCC reports or recommendations as I would think we need to do, that we have to actually not only stop emitting, but we have to suck the damn stuff out of the air that we've already put there, which is a whole focus that I think is just not given enough attention. That's question number one. Yeah. And question number two has to do with your notion that, yeah, different countries are different. Now, I see this as, I had a conversation last week about something similar to this issue, in which I regarded it as kind of tragic that different countries can contain, or different regions or different places can contain people who are so backward that can't be brought into awareness, and who are climate change deniers, or just to have vested interests and they don't want to play with what has to be done. And the person I was talking to, in fact, I can't even remember who it was, but that person said, no, it's really a good thing that you can even have more initiative taken by cities or by local districts or something, that they, because they have the opportunity to have more autonomy, more initiative, and are not controlled even by their national governments, much less by one centralized world government, that they can actually, there's more room for creativity. So I think there could be a very big difference of opinion there, because my initial reaction is, to get this thing done, we're going to need a coordinated global project headed by somebody who's going to be pretty authoritarian, has to actually issue the edicts pretty firmly about who's going to do what, so that somebody like Bolsonaro in Brazil can get away with chopping down all of the rainforest. So those are two lines of questioning that I have to get out there before you get carried away with something that's going to make me forget them.
Great. So thank you for those very important questions. I think it's going to be difficult to go into the details of each of those questions, but I'll try to cover some of the issues. First, on the timing of the report. So I think one key way to understand the time of these reports is to understand what the IPCC does and what it doesn't do. The IPCC does not produce science. They just assess, bring together scientific knowledge into one comprehensive report. In this case, the sixth assessment report. And the sixth assessment cycle includes not just the reports that were published the last week, but it also includes a series of special reports. So, for example, in 2019, there was a land report and there was an ocean report, both which are then used to bring in the most comprehensive analysis on the impacts of the climate crisis on oceans and land. And then before that, in 2018, you might remember, there was this 1.5 degrees Celsius report that was produced by the IPCC as well. And so, when we talk about a cycle, it's not just the three big reports that we're seeing now, but also the other reports that the IPCC produces every 2 to 3 years, depending on the topics that governments decide to analyze. And again, the IPCC does not produce the science, they just bring it together. And so, the IPCC does not limit these big institutions, universities, to continue to publish the updated studies on physical emissions, the impacts on land, food, and the other very important issues that are linked to the climate crisis. And so, the fact that it's every 5 to 6 years, it's because it's a body that is very dynamic. It is dynamic in the way it produces the different reports that I just mentioned, but also in providing evidence-based information to governments in other agencies. And the IPCC on its own, which then leads me a little bit to your point about, how do we get everyone together to act, actually provides advice to the United Nations Framework on Climate Change Convention, which is the political body where governments meet and where the Paris Agreement comes from. And that is where, the IPCC comes and puts forward the study and provides analysis and science-based facts to the ministers and policymakers that assist to a COP or a climate conference.
That's like the meeting that we held in Glasgow.
Exactly. And so the IPCC is the document that is going to be then brought into the negotiations, welcome, and governments then need to say what they want to do with this report moving forward. Mm-hmm. When it comes to negative emissions, The IPCC does work on many elements related to negative emissions, carbon dioxide removal options. Both they work on the role of artificial carbon dioxide removal options and natural carbon dioxide removal options. So natural sinks, oceans, the role of forest, and so on. And they also look at the artificial ones. They don't prescribe it. More and more, they have been really cautious into making sure that people understand that, you know, when we talk about negative emissions, it's not just getting the emissions out of the atmosphere. It's also an infrastructure. We need the infrastructure to make this happen. And it comes with many trade-offs. It comes with trade-offs when it comes to the land, access to food, depending on the technology that we use, depending on the technology that is analyzed, and the timing that when this is analyzed. We also have to look at the bad side of these technologies and how they could impact people and communities worldwide. So they have been trying to make sure that when we talk about technologies that would, to a certain extent, be seen as a replacement to reducing emissions right now, that people understand that it's not just as simple as saying they're there, but it is also a question of infrastructure. It's also a question of people and communities that could be impacted by these technologies. I think part of the way forward on this issue is going to be equity. You know, equity. In the sense that, you know, let's talk, for example, about carbon dioxide removal options that are related to bioenergy that require, an impressive amount of land to make BECCS work. It could have a direct impact on people and communities where the land is being used just for the sake of implementing this technology. And there are others. Geoengineering it's also something that is being studied to a certain extent, but it definitely comes with many trade-offs that need to be looked at very carefully, not just from a scientific perspective, but also from a political perspective.
That's what you're enunciating, is that there is a sense of caution, as if, automatically geoengineering is you have to presume that there are some major risks involved. And so this is highlighted, it seems to me. I'm much more, I'm doing what Greta Thunberg wants. I'm panicking, and I think she's right. We should all panic. And, given enough panic, you do some bolder things than you might otherwise. And that, for me, includes things like cloud brightening and things like removal of methane, various procedures for that, and so on. So, I just would hesitate to lump everything together and say geoengineering is risky, because it depends on what thing you're talking about. Exactly. So here, I've already hijacked your presentation. I don't let you get away with disagreeing with me, so go ahead.
That's fine. No, that's fine. And I think I think the IPCC has been very cautious that it comes with trade-off. It's not just one thing. There is a big difference between talking about carbon dioxide removal options such as afforestation, which is completely different. It is that is the role of nature, and then talking about technologies or artificial CDR, as we called it, and so I think a broader debate on equity will be required as we start getting to the tipping points, and but definitely I think one of the key messages from the latest IPCC report is that there is no current immediate substitute to reducing emissions radically for the next decade.
People tend to assume that the minute you say we need to do negative emissions, that everybody's going to jump to the conclusion that therefore we can go ahead and continue putting stuff out because we're just taking it out. I mean, of course, it's not you can't replace cutting back on emissions. Of course not. And I think it's absurd that anybody would assume that we would jump to that conclusion. That we can go ahead and emit all we please because now we have some way of cleaning it up.
You could take, for example, Canada. If all countries did like Canada when it comes to emitting annual emissions, we would be heading towards 3 degrees Celsius world. And, you know, it doesn't mean that Canada has not put forward a much more ambitious climate plan from what they had in 2016. It's just it is not adequate when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. And the problem with that is then when you start digging into what policymakers and some industries want to put forward as their solutions to reduce emissions and to do their part to address the climate crisis, they would definitely focus much more on these technologies, on these mechanisms, rather than cutting emissions. Let me just give you one example. Shell, the oil company Shell, put forward their net zero plans. And when they put forward the net zero plans, you know, they made a big splashy ad. They talked about it. They went to the media. They deliver their plan and big announcements. But when you look at the details of the plan, what they said was they would continue to extract, sell, produce, and increase oil production. But what they would do is that they would plant trees in an area the size of Spain, which is about 10% of the current land that we have available, according to the UN, for future afforestation plan to remain sustainable. And so that means that one single company, to achieve their own net zero plans, would force this kind of mechanism and take 10% of current land just for their own sakes, and so that they can continue to produce oil globally without any sense of accountability. That's their net zero plans. And so that is where the IPCC comes in and say it's not sustainable. That is where the science comes in and say, you may have net zero plans, you may have put up a climate plan, and some governments might like what you're putting forward, but that is not how emissions work. And it's not sustainable. And it is unfair to a certain extent. So bringing back that message that nothing replaces direct emission reductions from the source in the current decade, it's a very strong message for those industries and groups that would want to delay action while at the same time putting plans that they think are ambitious.
Okay, touche. You've proved it to me. I guess that there are people who want to cut corners that way. Okay, by using this. All right. But still, I mean, I think we have to do both. And now say in a situation like Shell puts out its big plan, and Shell is as powerful an organization as a whole bunch of small countries put together. How can you swap them down and say, Shell, I'm sorry, go back and start over because we won't accept this?
That is a very interesting question. They're too powerful. The oil and gas industry remains one of the most powerful and wealthiest sectors globally, dictating policy and influencing governments worldwide. I think we need to acknowledge it. They're rich, they have shareholders, which have a lot of influence within government. We've seen it in Canada. We've seen it how they have the capacity to reach out to ministries, have the capacity to, speak in parliament as with and members of parliaments as much as possible. Have the capacity to lobby 10 times as much as I and my organization are able to do. They not only in Canada but globally. I mean, oil and gas companies in many countries, they're owned by the government, by the country themselves, and so they have a direct influence on a domestic policy. So it is a huge, powerful sector. And it is not just about emission. This is energy policy, energy diplomacy. This is clearly one of the most difficult things that we need to look at right now. How do we counter the influence of oil and gas companies in Canada, but around the world? And let me tell you, to a certain extent, when it comes to pollution and how pollution has been tackled globally, you could think about, for example, mining. Canadian mining companies in the global south. You go to Africa, you go to Bolivia, you go to other some African countries, and there is a much more a greater understanding on how to use the courts to put forward complaints against mining companies. When it comes to oil and gas industry, there are some early efforts from some stakeholders that have brought Shell and other oil and gas companies to court. There are some tools like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is now signed by a couple of cities, calling for the end of the expansion of fossil fuels. But we still have a lot more work to do to put this greater accountability on the actions from oil and gas companies. Not only they're powerful enough to influence politics, but they have been very good at hiding the science and at greenwashing, using their ability to influence governments to put forward their own Paris compatible plans. And you see that more and more in Canada. Sometimes you see an oil and gas company say that they are meeting net zero plans and that they're going to offset by planting trees. At some point, even the Minister of Environment of Canada retweeted some of these strategies in his account. So we have a huge challenge at this moment to bring much more accountability and transparency. And the way forward for me is really simple. We need first movers, countries that come forward and say, this is the end. And there is one that is moving currently right now, putting forward the idea to Parliament, Costa Rica. Costa Rica is currently debating at this moment the end of the expansion of fossil fuels. It comes after Denmark's very bold proposition to end the expansion of fossil fuels. And what they are planning to do is create this group of countries that are called first movers, and that send a global message which aims to bring a global campaign to stop the expansion of fossil fuels, the same way that we've seen the Power in Pasco Alliance, which is a group of countries calling for the end of the expansion of coal globally.
you say Costa Rica. Well, that doesn't surprise me. Costa Rica is right there in front of everybody. Good bless their hearts.
Yes.
I watched last night, I think maybe it was Fareed Zakaria interviewing John Kerry. And the first thing he said is, look, one day you announce your enthusiasm about complying more adequately with the new IPCC report recommendations. And then a day or two later, you say something to ask for an expansion of oil production.
Totally.
You're talking out of both sides of your mouth. What's the story? And of course, Kerry, being a politician, has to say, oh, it looks like we're being contradictory, but really this is just a short-term thing that in the long term is going to help us solve the problem. Now, look, this guy is given a lot of authority in the US now to go for broke. You know, I think he's given more latitude to actually try to do more energetic actions in favor of climate reductions, emission reductions, and so on. But is he actually free to do so? I mean, here he's a politician. If he were able to speak freely, would he tell the truth?
The United States, they are in a very tricky spot at the moment. What they did by calling to boost oil production, it has been widely criticized. And clearly, this is the same government that in the beginning of the year was sending messages calling for a phase out of fossil fuels, zero carbon future. They organized a global summit, back for Earth Day, when they were sending these messages that we need to move away from fossil. And so everything that the US is doing right now is being scrutinized because this is a government that is delayed when it comes to climate action. They had 4 years under Trump, where there were a lot of rollbacks when it comes to climate action, but also environmental protection. And they're still catching up. And they are not there yet. The United States remain behind on so many issues, being their own climate targets, their own international obligations. And their move to call for the boost of oil production got a lot of criticism because it contradicts the spirit and the messaging that they have been putting forward when it comes to addressing the climate emergency. And certainly, I think that moving forward, even before COP26, we need to ask for greater accountability to the United States. It's not possible just for them to say one day we're for the climate crisis, for tackling the climate crisis to the highest possible way forward, and the next day they're also for boosting oil production and giving OPEC, greater powers to increase this oil production globally. If they really want to come back and try to influence climate diplomacy, global energy diplomacy, they need to stick to their messaging. And I think that the message from the US on boosting oil production didn't help their cause.
What about China? People, half the time I hear people say, oh, wow, China is really getting involved. They're doing all these, they're the global leader in solar and whatnot. And then half the time they say, oh, but look at all the coal they're still using. Okay, compare the US and China. Let's assume we're giving gold stars to good guys. How many gold stars would you give each one?
I think it's not possible to directly compare the United States with China for many reasons. I think it's possible maybe to compare the United States with Canada, But I mean, when it comes to China, what does China have? China, in 2020, they certainly uh, uh, put forward an ambitious pledge to meet carbon neutrality by 2060, which actually helped catalyze climate action at a moment where the United States was still in the election period, and and forced them also to review short-term actions. And so China in 2020 put forward that commitment. It had an important influence on future projections when it comes to net zero. And then they started to put down also policies on peaking emissions for 2026. But you're right, they continue to be coal exporters. It remains the country that emits the highest portion of emissions globally, and there is this. I think you would agree with me. Diplomatic rivalry between the United States and China, and the fact of the matter is that when it comes to China per se, the only way to really make sure that this big power comes together and puts forward strong climate policy is through cooperation with other big nations, not through antagonistic diplomatic relationships. And in an interview with the Secretary of State of the United States, he recognized that from all the other issues that the United States has to deal with China, be it human rights, development, democratic institutions, and so on, climate needed to be taken to a separate level of cooperation, because the climate crisis required the United States, China, and the EU, these three big groups, two big countries and one group of countries, to come together and agree on the way forward to make sure that the Paris Agreement goals remained achievable, and that is the kind of diplomatic space where we are right now. How do we find by COP26 a package, an agreement that allows for the United States and China to cooperate together to really make sure that we have both short-term emission reductions that allow for China to accelerate the decarbonization and peaking of emissions quicker, greater accountability of the United States at the domestic level, in particular when it comes to their own infrastructure investments, their own willingness to expand renewable energy, and then cooperation globally to make sure that the expansion of renewables happens at a greater scale than the increase of oil and gas, natural gas production globally. So there is this different components.
Let's unpack this word cooperation more, because I'm trying to think of what specifically needs to change in order to accomplish whatever you call cooperation. What is it that they're doing that's not cooperative now that's a problem? In what way is the competition or the even animosity between the two societies exacerbating the problem of China's emission?
China continues to make huge investments when it comes to carbon intensive infrastructure. They have this Belt and Road Initiative, which is a huge initiative that finances carbon intensive infrastructure in Africa and in Asia, And these are big investments that have a huge life cycle and are of great importance for the modernization of
Okay, so
African and Asian.
you would think that if they'd shut down this Belt and Road thing, that would help a lot?
I mean, if the question is what is China doing that is not helping greater climate cooperation, is investing in this carbon intensive projects in Asia and Africa. It is certainly delaying the decarbonization strategies of these countries. And so when it comes to cooperation, I think, part of the reason why this Belt and Road Initiative is really popular in some countries is because there is no offer from the United States and other like-minded countries like Canada, other countries in the EU, through the World Bank and the institutions that these countries have created, that is seen as much more accessible than the Chinese own Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure. So if we want greater cooperation, we need to look at why is it that so many countries are today relying on China, and what is it that the US and other countries can offer so that there is a competitive advantage to look for greater investments that actually help reduce emissions quicker.
Okay, so we're really talking about improving competition, not cooperation. We should get out there and compete and do it better in terms of building the equivalent to a Belt and Road Initiative, but one that is less carbon intensive.
At this moment, so the cooperation means avoiding antagonistic, blaming discourses from each side. We have one Paris Agreement. We need to limit global warming to 1.5. If we surpass this 1.5, bring it back as soon as possible. We have a decade to make sure that that there are sectoral policies that leave coal behind, fossil fuel behind, and we also need to recognize that the West needs to do it first, because that is the equitable element that is behind the Paris Agreement, and so with everything that I've said, antagonistic diplomatic relations really always delay these climate actions. So cooperation also includes having an understanding of what China and the United States can do together to make sure that there is a competition that will end up accelerating the decarbonization plans of African and Asian countries. So it is part of the broader package. The cooperation needs to happen at the Paris Agreement level, which is bringing all the countries together to have them agree that we need to move faster, and then putting forward all different mechanisms and institutions that are out there to facilitate the decarbonization of all these economies, in particular in Africa, wherever these funds are needed most. In particular, right now, because of COVID-19, which has shown the greater level of a scarcity of fiscal resources in many of these countries.
You've led toward another issue, which is sort of the social psychology of persuasion here. Because when you say don't blame, I think that really raises a real question to me, whether or not we want to get people to scare the daylights out of each other in order to really get some motivation going. And yes, we can't fool around anymore. We have to actually get serious about this. Or whether, and I have people in the, who are working on nuclear weapons, so that's my background mainly, who say, no, you don't want to frighten people. You want to always think of upbeat and positive motivations for people to make certain changes. But, I'm always happy when I hear that the IPCC has issued its latest dire warning that this is the end of the world, kiddo, unless you pull up your socks. And I think we have to actually do more of that. I kind of believe in not only blaming and shaming countries that don't do their part, although, then there's a real question of what actually will work. Because if you have countries that are simply blindly pursuing their own private interests, their own corporate interests, if you're talking about Shell or some other outfit, if you have countries and leaders that are succumbing to these, financial pressures, and so on, what kind of motivation is most likely to succeed in getting them to take this seriously and say, there's no more fooling around.
Yeah.
We can't build more pipelines. We can't ask oil companies to produce more, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe on the first point on blaming, I think blaming and shaming when you promise you wanted to do something and you don't deliver, I think that will continue, not just between countries, but also, civil society organizations. I think we're very good at showing that some of these commitments are not being met. So, but when it comes to diplomatic, the act of implementing diplomatic commitments, the antagonistic process didn't work. We had it before. We had it under Kyoto. If you remember Kyoto was all about blaming. It was all about these countries had this responsibility and they have to do it no matter what, without any consideration of the element of cooperation. So I think there are two different ways to look at that blaming issue that you're talking about. The first one is, what is it that countries need to do, and how they can contribute to implementing climate goals. I think that's what the Paris Agreement puts forward. It is definitely, up to each of the countries to say where they're at when it comes to responding to their own climate obligations and meeting Paris targets. And then you also have on the other side a goal and a mechanism of cooperation for these countries to talk to each other and then among themselves nudge each other, so that this level of increasing climate ambition over time represents what we call progress, the progression when it comes to advancing on climate goals. And we have seen the Paris Agreement only has 5 years. So it's early days to see if it has worked. But so far, we have seen progress, even from China. I mean, the fact that China now has a net zero target and is willing to put forward policies to peak emissions as soon as possible, it's definitely a demonstration that there is this kind of pressure, global pressure, so all countries put forward greater climate action. So to a certain extent, we have seen the influence of having a Paris Agreement that is not about blaming, but is much more on cooperation. And I think that is one key component of your answer. Then you're right. You're totally right that the gap still remains really high. It remains really high when it comes to limiting global warming to 1.5, not just on reducing emissions, but also on impacts, increasing adaptation capacity, increasing loss and damage, increasing financial support. All of these issues, we still have substantial gaps that, of course, would not be addressed all in one single meeting in Paris in 2015. But we have been able to unpack it more to make sure that they get addressed one after the other. And it allows external actors to put greater pressure on this issue and highlight them. The problem that we have is time. It is time, and I think that is one of the issues that we need to discuss at COP26 in Glasgow. How do we put forward some kind of compromise to move faster, not just to make sure that 1.5 is within reach, but that also we come together and try to implement sectoral policies faster as soon as possible in key sectors: fossil fuels, natural gas, coal, all in one single package, and really calling the shots. Because while the Paris Agreement has been very good at identifying the kind of mechanisms that brings countries together, it's certainly a political document with many interests. And if you look at the document, it never talks about fossil fuels. It never talks about key issues that have been ignored, like trade. It never talks about coal. These are things that we have been putting to the table after the Paris Agreement was negotiated, because they were absent and out of the negotiations for many political reasons. So we have something that allows us to create progress, build momentum, keep climate action at the center of global climate diplomacy, but we're still lacking mechanisms to address sectoral policies that are required on fossil fuels, on oil and coal and gas.
What about just payoff? I'm thinking, I haven't heard Bolsonaro say this in a while, but I think at least a few years ago, he was flat out saying, if you want me to save the rainforest, you got to pay me.
Yeah.
And so what about paying him? I mean, if we are in an absolute crisis, I mean, what would you do with a guy who's trying to put an end to human civilization? And I don't have any alternative.
Yeah, I mean, we're both in the same boat. It is difficult to debate with someone that is really stubborn and that has so many interests opposed to what the global community has agreed upon, which is like logic, like protecting the Amazon. It's a non-negotiable issue. So I mean, the Bolsonaros of this world are similar to the Trump of this world. These are leaders who in the global stage get isolated. And of course, we have seen the damaging political influence of Bolsonaro, but more and more, behind all of these tragedies, behind all of these really horrible decisions, there are humans and communities fighting really hard against these political powers. I know of many of my Brazilian colleagues, city leaders, leaders from regions, business sector, indigenous communities that are coming together to fight hard against Bolsonaro's policies. And sometimes it looks really difficult from the distance, there's a lot of uncertainty of what's happening in Brazil. But I know that there are people fighting against Bolsonaro and what he's doing to their people and the ecosystems. And I think that we need to extend the solidarity towards those heroes that are fighting every day, not only for the ecosystem but for their own democracy. And at the same time, I would say that Trump is a good example of a leader that really had the entire world against him because of climate, because of his climate positions. This is
what matters is he almost had the entire U.S. on side of him.
Exactly.
That's the problem. I mean, it makes you. I have a recurring theme, which is that democracy is broken. It's not working anymore because you get Trump, you get Bolsonaro, you get all of these other guys doing these not only horrible things in terms of global warming, but even, we told you guys, don't go into Afghanistan. It's not going to work. Yes. And we have friends, I have allies, I have solidarity to all of these dear friends and peace workers who are on my side, but we lost that one. It cost $1 trillion and a whole bunch of lives to find out that, yeah, that was a mistake. Mm-hmm. By now, maybe they will learn, but no, they won't learn. They'll do it next time too.
I mean, but I'm not sure I would say that, we should forget about democracy. I think that the climate crisis, I'm not an expert on military issues, so I would not be able to speak about that, but the climate crisis is a human crisis. And in Canada, in 2019, now we're in an election, but in 2019, it was people from different organizations, communities, Indigenous people, youth, came together and made the first climate-focused election in Canada. And more than 60% of those who voted, they elected a party and they voted for parties that had climate as their first priorities. And I really expect that we see that again. In the United States, it's the same. There are many youth movements, communities that came together and talked about the intersectionality between the climate crisis and social crisis, racism, colonization. They talked about gender inequality and the climate crisis, lack of accessibility of transportation and services related to environmental policies. And it became a very coherent discourse that said one single thing: it is a human crisis and power to people. And these people chose parties that committed to delivering a greater climate ambition. And it changed Biden. It changed Biden's policies. That's why he organized a climate summit. So I would not rule out democracy. I would say we need to, it just increases our work as civil society to make sure that constantly we bring political powers to their responsibilities, put greater accountability, and come as much as possible together to make sure that we force political powers to listen to the science and to listen to the needs of people as we respond to the climate crisis.
Amen. I mean, of course, I'm not giving up on democracy. It's just that I think we got to fix it. We got to do better in using it. That's all there is to it. It's not working as well as it should. But thank you for what you're doing, and bless your heart. I mean, we've got a row ahead of us, but I'd love to hear more, and let's stay in touch. Okay.
Thank you so much, Metta.
All right. It's been a terrific conversation. Thanks so much, Eddy. Bye.
Bye.